Hi, I'm Rob Jan, one of the team members here at Dynatrace, and I'm excited to show one of the new features off for Keptn, which is called the new Webhook service. And this is a way that we can trigger downstream tools very easily with just a simple configuration. And I'm going to demonstrate that today with GitHub Actions, which is a great way to trigger different logic that you may have already invested in. And so let's get started. So the first use case I'm going to do, and there's going to be two, is this silent webhook. So in this case, if you look on the right on the animation, we're basically having a sequence that's executed in the Keptn control plane that's going to trigger some tool. So in my demo, I'm going to show an SLO validation as my task. As it sends back its finished event, this is where we've configured a webhook that has a task finish subscription that it's going to call the API to a GitHub action workflow to actually trigger a test run. So on the left, you can see some of the details which I'm going to walk through, which is the GitHub action is configured for listening to what's called a repository dispatch trigger, and then we can just perform some simple logics just to demo that. So let's start with the configuration of the webhooks themselves. So I'm going to go into my demo project, going to go into the uniform, and if you notice here, the services, I have the webhook service, and setting up a new subscription is easy as adding it, but in my case I've got a couple configured, so let's look at the one that I've got set up. So what we're looking for in this case is listening to an evaluation finished event because we're just passively listening for it, as I mentioned, the silent use case, and we're posting into the API of a GitHub repo that I've got set up, and I'm passing in the authorization and the token, which is stored in Keptn under a secret. And this is the GitHub Action Personal Access token that I've set up. And this API is going to be consistent. So API github.com is always going to be the same. And the repo is your custom repo. So I have one called Rob Webhooks. And then there's an endpoint called dispatches. So that's how it's going to be listened for on the GitHub side. And here I'm passing in an event type. Payload, and this structure is very important to understand. There are two attributes, one called an event type, and this name silent is what has to match on the webhook, on the GitHub action workflow, and then any custom data is sent in an attribute called custom payload with a JSON object. And all of these attributes are things that are the inside of the cloud event, so the data project service staged, context, etc., can be sent and constructed. So here you can look at the payload viewer, and any of these attributes can be used with this convention here. So if we switch over into my demo project here, GitHub Actions are stored under the Actions tab, which we'll look at, but then the workflow itself is stored under a .github workflows. This is where they're stored. And let's look at the silent example. And as I mentioned, it's going to be listening for a repository dispatch, and this name's silent. If you remember, that's what matched the event type in the payload that we have to send in, and then the job continues on, and it's going to be something very simple, just showing my payload values and pulling out of the event that got passed in into that client payload. Again, I can refer to those as this dot convention, and let's go ahead and trigger this so that we can see what it actually looks like. So if I come into my editor, I'm going to just send in a Keptn evaluation event, which is going to go into my environment. Let's go over to Keptn real quick, take a look at the sequences. This actually is running right now, you can see, and it's pulling in my SLI, and all I'm really interested in is the evaluation complete. So once this SLO is done, that's when the trigger event takes place, and you can see it's completed. And what we're listening for is the production evaluation finished event. So if I go quickly back to my project, go into my actions, maybe we can catch it. We've got, see now my silent job just ran. Let's go and look at the details, and we can look at the output. And it's here, you can see it's just a display of the silent webhook received, and it's just displaying out the data. So in reality, you would probably have your real logic, but just for demo purposes, that shows the mechanism of the webhook being subscribed to the triggered event. The triggered event calls the API of the GitHub action, and now my GitHub action actually executes. The second use case I'm going to do is now called the interactive use case. So if, again, look at the animation on the right. So we're going to have our control plane executing a task, which is going to be the triggered event for that task. And we now have configured a webhook to subscribe to a task triggered event. And based on that, that's going to call our downstream tool, which is GitHub, to run a Git flow action, which is simulating some sort of work. And then when that's done, It's the job of the GitFlow action to construct the cloud event to send back to the control plane so that the sequence can continue and complete. So for this use case, let's start by taking a look at our shipyard file, because this is where we're simulating the execution of a remote task. So in my production stage, I have a sequence which you'll see running called my sequence, and within my sequence, I just have a task called my task interactive. So what I've done is switch back to my code editor to show you how we're going to trigger the execution of the sequence. So we're going to send in an event, production sequence triggered, which is going to start our workflow, and I'm going to pass in certain data with this event. So let's go, and I've written a simple shell script that's going to trigger this event by calling the Keptn API using this file. And so if we switch over to Keptn, we can see that my sequence is actually started, and it has a my sequence, which is the name of the sequence, and I have a task, and the webhook has started. And I'm going to quickly jump over to my environment and look at my actions, and hopefully we can catch it. Good. So now you can see it's actually automatically running. So in this case, it's started the sequence, started the task. The task has triggered the webhook action, which I've called interactive. And maybe we can kind of watch it run here real time. So it's loading up. Okay, so now my job has started, and what it's doing here is it's received the interactive webhook call, and now it's going to send back to Keptn this event. So what it's done is constructed, and we'll look at the code in a second, of the cloud event that needs to be sent back to the control plane to say that my interactive task has finished. This is the important piece. So my task is finished, and this detail is also important, that the Keptn context and the triggered ID need to match so that when it comes back to cloud automation, it will complete. So what we sent back in was this event, which you can now view in the bridge, that my task has finished with the context and the triggered ID, and as a result of that task being completed, now my overall sequence has completed, and that's done. Okay, so let's look at how that was configured. So back to our uniform file, let's look at our webhook service. Let's go to, in this case, my task triggered event. Let's edit it, and it's going to look very similar to the last one, except for now I'm subscribing to my task interactive triggered event. Same API, same endpoints, because it's the same repo, same secret. In this case, I passed in an event type interactive. In the previous one, we passed in event type silent. So let's go look at the code in GitHub, and let's see how that workflow was constructed. So back in the GitHub, in this case, I have a different job called interactive. So if we look at it, it was listening for the dispatch with the event type called interactive, and ran this code. So the first step was just basically building up a JSON payload. This is just a Unix shell script to construct this, and it's looking for the Keptn context and the ID coming in from the payload here. And then it's basically calling the Keptn API to pass in this event. And so this API and token over here are stored as GitHub action secrets. So these two things, the ID and the context, let me go back to Cloud Automation. If you look in the payload that was sent, this is where the ID and the Keptn context were sent in with this event to the GitHub action. The GitHub action parsed this value, constructed a new event, and that's what sent it back into the sequence that we saw here to complete it. One more important detail when understanding how the interactive webhook is different from the silent is a particular flag that goes in with the webhook itself. So here I am in my project file. If I drill into the webhook configuration, which is the webhook YAML, we can see all the subscriptions that I was set up on my bridge UI. The one that we want to look for is one called the My Task Interactive Triggered, and you can notice that there's a flag called send finished equals false. It's important that this value is there so that the control plane can properly wait for the task to be interactively sent by the downstream service. So that concludes our demos. So definitely reach out to me, reach out to the team. There's lots of links here of how you can get engaged with the community. Love to hear your examples back. Thanks for watching.